My name is Noah Meir. I am the CEO of the Charney Forum for New Diplomacy. A key feature of the digital revolution is the unprecedented volume of information, which has caused a disruption in most, if not all, aspects of our lives, including in the field of diplomacy. The global crisis created by COVID-19 exacerbates this disruption, increasing the need to address the many challenges created: information overload, hyperconnectivity, social media, and countless news feeds have all led to sectarian discourse, fake news, and echo chambers. The Charney Forum, in collaboration with the University of Haifa, offers workshops, seminars, and conferences, and online panels with top-notch speakers and experts, such as the two joining us tonight. We offer diverse content presenting a wide range of perspectives about complex issues, providing practical skills and tools to navigate the information overload, global collaborations, and the extensive use of digital platforms. Our programs take place in Israel, overseas, and these days mostly online. Here with us today is Tzili Charney, who spearheaded the Charney Forum for New Diplomacy a couple of years ago on the tail end of the previous era to deal with the overload of information, and as she aspires to promote open, diverse, and effective civil discourse amongst people and between organizations. I'd like now to introduce our two wonderful speakers for tonight. First is Ambassador Ido Aharoni, chairman of the Charney Forum for New Diplomacy and the visionary behind it, global distinguished professor at NYU, former Israeli consul general in New York, and that's just one of the many esteemed positions he did during his 25 years of service as a diplomat. Ambassador Aharoni will be leading the conversation with Dr. Chuck Freilich, former national security advisor in Israel, adjunct professor at Columbia and Tel Aviv universities, awarded the Chaikin Cathedral Award from the University of Haifa, and author of several books, the latest, Israeli National Security, A New Strategy for an Era of Change. So without further ado, Ambassador Aharoni and Dr. Freilich, take it away.
Thanks to Tzili Charney's generosity and the work of the staff, Noah and Maya, the head of the programming, and Einat, who's the head of the administration, I think that we managed to do something that very few organizations managed to do, which is to really build brand, to build the presence. We are joined here by many friends and leaders in the Jewish community from many organizations. Susan from Philadelphia is a leader with Israel Bonds, and Manette from Montreal is a leader with the Hebrew University. And we have so many friends here. I just would like to acknowledge the presence of two very distinguished ambassadors. Ambassador Schiffer, who's here joining us from London, and Ambassador Meir, who's joining us with his wife, Dr. Amira, from Jerusalem. We have two professional athletes with us. One is an Olympic medalist, Tony Irvin, who won 4 Olympic medals. And last but not least is my dear friend, Mark Sack from Cleveland, who played professional basketball in Israel. This is my third conversation with Dr. Chuck Freilich, who's my friend and my colleague. And I always enjoy talking to him because he always brings a new angle to every conversation. Dr. Freilich, the first question that I have for you obviously relates to the COVID-19 crisis, which is a global crisis, but what can we say about the way Israel is handling the crisis?
The COVID-19 crisis, actually, it's one of only 6 different crises that the state of Israel faces at the moment. It's certainly one of the worst that we face. Now, I think the Prime Minister and the government get a lot of credit for the way they handled the crisis in the beginning. And Israel really was a success story that was noted by leaders and experts around the world. Unfortunately, once the initial crisis seemed to have dissipated, the government lost its focus, it lost control. And to me, at least, it was pretty clear almost as soon as they started releasing people that this was an uncontrolled release and that we were going to be in trouble very quickly, and we are now. And it's, of course, and this isn't unique to Israel, it's not just a health crisis, it's a dramatic economic crisis, probably the worst that we've ever faced in over 70 years of of Israeli statehood. It's happening at a time when there are a number of other crises, which we'll talk about at the moment, and the combined effect is something of a perfect storm. It is now becoming a deep political crisis for the prime minister. And it could be a political game changer if he doesn't manage to turn things around very quickly.
Interesting thing about what's happening in Israel is that the virus itself did not hit hard, but it's the economic lockdown that brought about a national devastation. So what do you think needs to happen now in order for Israel to avoid further deterioration?
First of all, the whole process has to be depoliticized. And one of the critical factors that's affected how this has been handled from the beginning has been the cross between the prime minister's political or legal problems. And he has to appoint call it a corona czar, or the Hebrew term is a proyector, a project manager. There has to be one figure who has overall responsibility for handling things day to day. Of course, beneath the prime minister, he won't release his overall prerogatives here. He couldn't if he wanted to. But there has to be somebody who is devoted to this 24/7. And it has to be someone of true national stature. And there were people like that who were willing to take what may even be a thankless job on themselves. For example, the former chief of staff, Gadi Eisenkot, had agreed, and former General Numa had agreed. And it doesn't have to be a general, but these are people, of course, who have got experience managing huge projects, huge undertakings, and they know how to do it in crisis situations. And in the end, they either were not offered the position by the prime minister, or in the end didn't want to take it because they weren't given the prerogatives that you need to make it work. So one thing is we really need that. Then what we need is a comprehensive policy here to get us through the difficult times. We can't have changing government policies every day. One day this is okay, the next day it's not. We've been way behind, of course, in the testing process, and especially the epidemiological process of the infection chain. We're a half a year into this just about, and we still don't have that. And if there's one thing that the state of Israel is usually good at, it's crisis management, to doing things really quickly. We're not quite as good at regular day-to-day management. Why haven't we done that after half a year? We also have to see some more coherent, comprehensive economic stimulus packages. So far, we've seen a number of emergency ones, not enough yet.
Now, let me ask you a question about COVID-19 in the context of diplomacy. Many people compare the situation, the depth and the magnitude and the scope of the crisis, to what the world had experienced post-World War II. And one of the outcomes of World War II was the creation of the United Nations in an attempt to create a more collaborative form of international relations and diplomacy. And there's a big debate whether COVID-19 will actually give rise to populist and nationalistic sentiments, or there's another camp that says, will give rise to more international solidarity and collaborative diplomacy. What do you think?
That's an interesting question. Well, first of all, the good news is that we're not starting this from the point of global devastation that existed after World War II. We're starting from a pretty good position. I think the answer to your question, and of course it's too early to give a definitive answer because this is going to be with us for a while, and we can't even begin to really fathom where it's going to end up taking us. But for the moment, I think the answer is pretty clearly that it's taking us in the direction of narrower national perspectives, greater emphasis on nationalism, on your own narrow national concerns, and less multilateralism. And this is really a case where we do need a multilateral, preferably global, but at least a broad international response. No one can solve this completely on their own. Some are better equipped to than others, but if one country solves it and opens up, there people from the rest of the world are going to be coming in and infecting them all over again. So in the end, we do need a global response here. And to my great sorrow, the primary candidate to fulfill that role, the United States, is not there for it today. It's just not fulfilling that role.
Can you say a word about the global implications of the outcome of the November elections in the United States?
Well, I think these are one of the more particularly important elections. All elections are important, historical. I think this one is particularly so. I'll say something that maybe some of our listeners will consider partisan. It's not. I couldn't care less about Republicans or Democrats, Likud or Kahol Lavan or whatever. I do care greatly about policy. And I think President Trump is a gentleman who has his own attributes in life. I think he is uniquely unsuited to be president of the United States. And I think he has demonstrated that pretty much across the board. Now, if anyone wants to leap up and says, yes, well, he's had some successes over the years, of course. It's hard to be in office for 4 years and not do anything right. But I think he's had a number of major failures, and I think he has taken us in the wrong directions in a whole variety of areas. And I think the United States and the world, and we can get into this afterwards for Israel, I think we all need to change.
Well, that's a wonderful segue to my next question. We're here to talk about Israel's national security. You served as a national security advisor.
Deputy, you guys have both promoted me. I was the deputy national security advisor.
All right. Well, we know in government, the deputy is more important than we know that. So you served in many positions of not only influence, but you had the privilege of looking at the system from 30,000 feet. And so let's talk about the annexation, the plan that was announced by the current Israeli government in the context of Israel's national security. Is it good? Is it bad? What happened to it?
Well, first of all, let's look at it just from a decision-making perspective, and then in terms of the substance as a policy. I think everyone, right, left, Likud, Kahol Lavan, whatever party, should be dismayed by the decision-making process that took place here. This was not a war thrust on us. This was not a surprise attack. This was an Israeli initiative. An Israeli initiative which was taken because some believed that there was a unique opportunity, a window of opportunity, stemming primarily from the fact that we have the unwavering support of the Trump administration for this move. And that turned out not to be the case, that the Arab world and the international community were so weak that they could not mount an even partially effective response and opposition to this. That may have been partially correct. And that the timing was propitious otherwise, which it clearly was not. It was at the height of the Corona crisis. There's the old expression that Washington is a one crisis town. Well, Jerusalem is also, there's a limit to what the traffic can bear. Not all of these things could have been done at once. So that's on the decision-making level. In terms of substance, you have to ask, why do this? Now, for people who support the move on an ideological level because they wish to incorporate the Judea and Samaria into the state of Israel, I'm not going to have an ideological debate. I try and look at things in terms of practical ramifications. What does a policy change for the better and what does it change for the worse? Now, on non-ideological grounds, I don't see any positive change here. We're in control of the territory in any event. So what do we gain by changing the formal status? I do see, we don't have enough time for this, an enormous array of negative, in some cases severely negative ramifications. Start from the fact that already today, we face a serious demographic challenge. And if we want to maintain Israel as a predominantly Jewish and vibrantly democratic state, if you're willing to compromise one of those two principles, then you don't have much of a problem. I'm not. Why would we possibly wish to incorporate more territory, which means more people who do not believe in the Zionist dream? The Zionist movement never defined a precise ratio, what percentage of the population has to be Jewish for Israel to be the nation state of the Jewish people. We certainly never thought it was 100% or 90%. But today, Israel and the West Bank, the ratio is 60-40. I know of no definition of Zionism which makes that a Jewish state. Why would we want to make the ratio even worse? Unless there was some huge positive gain. As I said, I don't think there is. What some people, we don't even know what annexation means. It started out with people saying the entire West Bank, and then it was the 30% under the Trump plan, and then it was maybe the Jordan Valley and the settlement blocks, and then it was just the valley or just the settlement blocks, or maybe just one of the settlements, maybe just Ma'ale Adumim. So first of all, we're having a discussion here about something none of us know what this is, and the fact that I don't know isn't terrible. The fact that the prime minister didn't know until the due date, which was July 1, and still doesn't know, that is terrible. So one thing is, how does this help us in terms of maintaining our fundamental character as a Jewish and democratic state? Then if you look across the board, this, even without doing it, we're already paying negative prices in terms of Israel's international standing. Had we done it, this could have led to a violent conflict, a confrontation in the West Bank with Gaza. If those two happened, it could have led to a conflict with Hezbollah, potentially with the Iranians in Syria. The Jordanian monarchy is dead against it, viewed this as a threat to their stability. We might have forced them in Egypt, even though they don't want to do it, we could have forced them into drastic steps if things got really bad, even an abrogation of the peace with Israel. Europe, at least some countries, were going to impose sanctions, and I can go on and on. And then just what would it do for our relations with the non-Republican part of the United States? And again, I don't care Republicans, Democrats. I want American support. We'll talk about that afterwards, I believe. This is a case of the state of Israel shooting itself in its feet of its own accord, out of its own volition. I'm glad that it's been postponed, and I think it's been killed. That's the only good news in this otherwise sad story.
So your prediction is that it's off the table?
I believe so.
All right, that's an interesting prediction. That's an interesting prediction. I wanted to ask you about your book. Your book is really an overview of Israel's national security with recommendations for the future. But let's, first question about the book. What are the pillars historically of Israel's national security? And do you see it as a success story?
First of all, I think there's some good news here. And that, yes, I think Israel's national security strategy has been a dramatic success. First of all, we're here. That was not a foregone conclusion in the early decades by any means. In other countries, if you say, well, I'm here, people say, okay, so. And if you say, well, there are no existential threats anymore, at least unless Iran goes nuclear, and frankly, we can handle that also. So there are no existential threats. There are no conventional threats, in other words, army to army of consequence anymore. There are significant threats out there. I can talk about them in a minute. There's Hezbollah, there's Hamas, and certainly if Iran goes nuclear. There are cyber threats, but there are no conventional threats. We won our existence. Now the question is, what kind of existence we're going to have? Ben-Gurion famously said that if and when Israel had a Jewish population of 5 million, our survival would be ensured. Well, today we have over 7 million. That's a number that I don't think he could have possibly fathomed in his day. So there's good news. There are severe threats. I think we can handle a nuclear Iran through our strategic deterrence, but it would be a terrible turn for the worse, and it's something we should do everything we can to prevent. Hezbollah is a severe threat. It's by no means existential, but I don't think that most of the citizens of Israel and our friends abroad understand how bad the next round will be if and when it takes place. The home front will be hit in a way that it has never been hit in the history of the conflict. 130,000+ rockets, increasingly precise ones, and that's the real danger, is the precise ones. Combine it with some cyber, with other weapon systems that we're going to face. It's going to be an ugly event. So military might is still the fundamental basis for Israel's national security. I think that you said, what are the pillars? Well, there are 3 or 4. One is, first of all, is the resilience and the commitment of the people of Israel. That's something that's hard to measure. It's something which a state can lose relatively quickly. We're losing it over the coronavirus, but that's a specific issue. One of the success stories is actually the deep commitment that most people in Israel still feel to the national cause. We argue over everything, but pretty much everyone's still committed to the fundamentals of Israel's existence. A second thing is the IDF's might, and that is intimately linked to our relationship with the United States. And here I am deeply concerned about the trends. And then there's the question of how you handle yourself, both strategically and day to day. And here I think we have to make a significant change. It's a change which I think we can allow ourselves because our existence is no longer in doubt. And it's a change which is also partly thrust upon us by the dramatic changes that have taken place in the last 2 or 3 decades in the nature of the military threats that Israel faces and the nature of the international community as a whole. And I think that the strategy today should be based on, or the military side of the strategy should be based on 5 points. First of all, restraint. We're strong enough today so that we do not have to respond to every rocket. Truth be told, we don't anyway. But I believe that we can exercise even greater restraint. We're strong enough to do it. It's not as if we have a great military solution to every one of these problems anyway. So save the military effort, the offensive efforts, for more opportune times. The second point is deterrence, to try and prevent the conflicts from happening. There's a common wisdom which says that it's very hard, and it is, to deter non-state actors. Well, it took us a few decades to build up so-called cumulative deterrence against the Arab states. It's even harder maybe with organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas, but we are building up deterrence against them, doing reasonably well. It's now almost 16 years to the day, 14 years to the day, since the 2006 war. Who would have thought that we'd have had 14 years of quiet with Hezbollah? The third element is defense. Now, we've deployed a partial national rocket defense system. I think we have to bite the bullet. What I'm talking is billions of dollars, but there are ways to make that happen. And we have to deploy essentially a national rocket shield. I'm not talking about something which is 100% hermetic. There's no need for that. We can get into this some more in the Q&A. We cannot allow ourselves to live at the mercy of a Hezbollah threat. And for a few $1 billion, I think we can essentially neutralize that threat. The fourth element is diplomacy. For reasons of the nature of Israel's establishment, we were born out of war, we were fighting for decades. We've always emphasized military solutions, and the Arab countries weren't willing to talk to us in the early decades. So we didn't have much choice. Well, we have peace with Egypt and Jordan. We have a budding relationship with the Saudis and the other Gulf states. There's interest in relations, or at least unofficial ties, in Muslim states beyond the region. We're in a different world today, and the world in general has changed. We have to put far more emphasis on diplomacy than we have in the past. Those are some of the major things that we have to do, I believe. And
well,
maybe,
we certainly,
and
please.
And then, of course, the relationship with the United States, which is, I believe, of existential importance for the state of Israel.
So let's talk about that for a second. Where do you see this going? Clearly, Israel, diplomatically, if we can say that, and in terms of foreign policy, in the last 13, 14 years, bet on one side of the political equation in the United States. And this would have a grave consequence, I guess, to Israel's future. Where do you see it's going?
I think one of the primary reasons for the success of the US-Israeli relationship over the decades is the fact that it was bipartisan. And as you know, as someone who has led far more congressional delegations and visits to Israel than I, they like to joke about the fact that just about the only issue that they can agree on is bipartisan support for Israel. That's critical. It's not a question of Republicans or Democrats. We need overwhelming support on both sides. Support on the Republican side is very high, and that's great. What we've seen in the last 2 years is a precipitous drop in support on the Democratic side, especially among the young, but along most age groups. We also know that 70 to 80% of the Jewish community votes Democratic, and that's another pillar of Israel's national security. If you look at what's happening in the Democratic camp as a whole, especially the more progressive wing, which also is where much of the Jewish community is, if you look at what's happening in the Jewish community, if you look what's happening among young people in the United States, we are messing around with the future of our most important strategic relationship. We are threatening it. There is absolute fury on the Democratic side. It's pent up. They're waiting for the opportunity to let it out because now they can scream and shout, but if Mr. Biden is elected, they can turn it into policy. If the two houses go Democratic, they can really turn it into policy. Now, I think Mr. Biden is a friend of Israel's and he will block the extreme tendencies, but he won't be able to block all of it. And we see the Ocasio-Cortezes, the Talib, what's her name?
Rashida Tlaib, yeah.
Rashida Tlaib, and others. We saw that Congressman Engel was just defeated. It's going to be a slightly different Congress from that point of view. But even those, the majority who are still friendly to Israel, are going to be facing a different electorate. I think that the relationship with the United States is existential. In other words, there is a question whether the state of Israel can even exist without the United States today. And that's, to my way of thinking, a horrible question. Because it took us 2,000 years to reestablish our national sovereignty. After 70 years, you can ask that question, whether we can even survive without another country. I posed that question in some forums I addressed in the IDF, in the National Security Council, and others. And I thought people were going to fall out of their seats when I said, can we even survive without the US? And the reaction that I got was, oh, yeah. Of course, that's a very good question. The answer is probably no. No, maybe we can. In desperate circumstances, people find desperate solutions. Maybe we can exist, but it's an infinitely weaker existence, less secure. It's an infinitely poorer existence. If that's the case, then we ought to be thinking about how we go back to policies that are bipartisan or that enable bipartisan support. We should never be taking on the President of the United States in Congress. I don't care what the issue is or who the president is. We can disagree quietly behind the scenes, but we don't take on the president in a, make it look like the OK Corral. We have to coordinate our policy with the United States as closely as is possible.
Maybe I should mention to our listeners who may not be as familiar with the history with the diplomatic history of Israel, that Israel was not always on the American side. There was a big debate, very lively debate, political debate in Israel of the 1950s, whether Israel should follow the Soviet orientation versus the American orientation. The debate even entered was definitely the reason for the big divide in the kibbutz movement, but even within the IDF, there was a debate whether Israel should follow the Soviet orientation or the American orientation. And in between, Israelis were very much, and until this very day, interestingly enough, when you look at Israeli diplomacy, it is still very much Eurocentric. If you look at Israeli diplomacy, the way it operates, the thinking, Israel's diplomacy is certainly still, in my view, overemphasizing the importance of Europe. Europe is very important, but as you correctly said, the United States is far more important than Europe for Israel's future. Now, from one cheerful subject, I'd like to move to another cheerful subject, Iran. So some people claim that what happened recently is a major setback to the Iranian nuclear program. The question that I have for you is, what do you think is going to be the Iranian reaction? And what do you think needs to happen in order for the international community to effectively contain the posed threat by Iran's nuclear aspirations?
I don't know how Iran is going to respond to this. Okay, I think it would be hard to make a really informed judgment here. They probably have to do something. There have been a number of attacks. They look bad for their own domestic opinion. They've got presidential elections next year. Strategically, they probably have to do something. And at the same time, the Iranians are in a difficult position. The US withdrew from the deal, but the E3, Russia and China, are all insisting that they remain in the deal, that they adhere to it. That's not a position that they want to be in. They've tried numerous military attacks in the last year on the tankers excuse me, oil tankers shooting down a huge American drone, $140 million drone, an unprecedented attack on the Saudi oil infrastructure. None of that helped. President Trump didn't respond to any of them. Each of those attacks, certainly the combination in the past, would have been considered an act of war, I think, by any other president. So their military attempts to force a change have not helped. Their attempts to pressure the Europeans into forcing the US to adhere to the plan, or at least then compensating them for their losses, that hasn't worked. Nothing that they've tried has succeeded so far. At the moment, I think they're biding their time in the hope, from their point of view, that Mr. Biden will win. And they've listened to the rhetoric on the Democratic side, and they may hope that, well, maybe Mr. Biden will agree to go back into the JCPOA as it was. I don't think he will. I would be quite surprised. And I'm a supporter of the JCPOA as the best of the bad options that existed at the time. And I hope we can get back to a new and better deal. But to go back to the existing agreement, which was already, by the way, 5 years in, it only has 10 to 15 years. That doesn't seem to be a good idea. To go back into the deal and squander the pressure, the leverage that President Trump has achieved, that doesn't seem to be wise. What I think we need is finally to adopt a comprehensive strategic approach to Iran. And a comprehensive approach means, yes, maximum pressure, economic, diplomatic. It means ongoing sabotage. Whoever did this, Israel, the US, both of us, the man on the moon. It means trying to counter Iran's regional expansionism in Syria and elsewhere. And above all, or not above all, but of great importance, it means trying to reach a new and better deal. And there is a really sad fact here, and that is a new and better deal for the US and Israel. Well, we're only going to get it if it's better for Iran also, because otherwise there's no way that they'll agree to a new deal. And so we're also going to have to make some painful concessions. And I think more thought has to be given to that.
Well, thank you. I think that we are just at the moment where we would like to turn the discussion to our great participants that have a few questions. Noah, how would you like to handle this? Would you like to ask the questions? You would like me to ask the questions?
Either way, if you see them, you're welcome to ask them, and also just encourage everyone else. We have a few questions, but others to submit theirs.
Yes, so please use the chat function. And Bill from San Diego, professor of international law, is asking, is a one-state solution totally out of the question? That is, all of Israel, West Bank, Gaza, etc., in one democratic state. That is not necessarily a Jewish state. My question does not mean that I support that option, but should I now ignore that possibility?
I would say that 0% chance of that happening would be a wildly overestimation of the prospects of it happening. Some people think that the idea of a one-state solution is some sort of new, novel, creative idea. The two-state solution has failed, so let's go to the one state. What these people forget is that that was actually the Arab position from the beginning of the conflict. More importantly, the Jewish people spent 2,000 years waiting for the opportunity to restore our national sovereignty. There is essentially no one in Israel, from left to right, who is willing to even contemplate that idea if you're talking about one binational state. And some people think, yeah, but that's a great democratic idea. Why shouldn't we do it? And in theory, I agree. In theory, it sounds very nice. Well, It's not often that history gives us a preview of what something would look like. If anybody wants to know what a binational state in the Middle East looks like, look no further than Syria and Iraq. Is that really what we wish for ourselves? What we wish for the Palestinians? It is a catastrophe. It won't happen because no one in Israel will agree, and it shouldn't happen. We have to go back to the two-state solution. Actually closer to 30 years of two-state diplomacy has not succeeded. Sometimes it takes a long time before things happen. One of the big problems is that, of course, there's no vacuum. There isn't really a status quo. Land that was available for land swaps has been used in the meantime for other purposes, so it's even harder to make the swaps that would be necessary. Positions have hardened on both sides. People come up with ideas like annexation. What we have to do is maintain the option to achieve a two-state solution if and when the political wherewithal is there on the two sides. It's not today. Certainly not prevent us from being able to do it in the future.
Now, Avi is asking a question. Iran and China have teamed up on multiple levels, posing an increasing threat to our region and bouncing back on US sanctions. What do you think the US should do in response?
All right. First of all, we also have the report, I believe it was yesterday. And I would just add a small word of caution, which is it's an early report, and I think it was probably a report put out there by people who wanted to get a certain message across. But that, if the details may be wrong, maybe it's not a $400 billion deal, that's really secondary. The important point here is that American unilateralism here, withdrawing from the deal, not being willing to cooperate with American allies, let alone China and Russia, but trying to impose everything on them, it doesn't work that way in the world. You can't go it alone. And so the fact that the US acted unilaterally, well, this is one of the consequences. So I think that whoever's in the White House in November or in January has to go back to a more unilateral approach. That doesn't mean giving in to your allies' whims every time. It does mean that you have to take the considerations, their needs into account, because otherwise you drive, well, China is certainly not an ally, but China is also being driven into a position of hostility. It's not an innocent player here. And when you try and just box Iran in and not really give them any options, well, people look for their solutions when they're up in a corner.
Manette from Montreal is asking, given the increasing friction between the US and China, Israel finds itself in a very dangerous spot, having to choose. What do you think is going to happen there?
In the end, there's no choice. We know the answer. The answer is the United States. Right? That's a no-brainer. What isn't a no-brainer is how do you remain a totally committed friend of the United States and address American concerns while at the same time, well, China's a rising superpower. It's a major superpower today. And we certainly don't want to alienate China for a variety of reasons. We don't want to lose a burgeoning economic relationship with China. And China is beginning to be a diplomatic and military player in the region. Now, most people in the audience probably are not familiar with the crisis that erupted between the US and Israel in the late 90s and early 2000s over the sale of the Falcon early warning aircraft to China and the Harpy missile system. And I won't get into the details, it's not important. It was actually just about maybe the worst crisis, certainly one of the 2 or 3 worst crises in the history of the US-Israeli relationship, because Israel was selling these early warning aircraft to China. China at the time was looking at Israel to be its primary source of weapons. This was going to be a dramatic strategic change for Israel, billions of dollars, many billions of dollars, huge ramifications. And the US stepped in and said, no, you can't do it. And there was a whole story about it. We mishandled it at the time. I'm glad that the lessons have been partly learned, maybe not 100%. We have to handle this with great care. Some of the American concerns here about Huawei, for example, some of the infrastructure investments, I think are more justified. My understanding, the concerns about the Haifa port are less justified. In fact, I think that's just more of some American sensitivities that we're rubbing up against, and we can find solutions for that. This has to be handled carefully. So, of course, the relationship with the United States is in no way affected, and so we don't lose out on the relationship with China.
Now, Bill from San Diego is asking, how many people would you say in Israel are in favor of the annexation idea of the Jordan Rift Valley?
Well, of the valley itself, I don't know. I don't remember the numbers. The valley is sort of consensual because people look at it as being of really overwhelming security and or defense importance. If you look at, say, annexation of the West Bank as a whole, there's only about a third of the public that supports that. And if you look at the number of people who thought that annexation was the top priority at the moment, it was 4% of the public. Well, I think that gives you an idea.
That's where it is. One last question before we conclude the session. Ambassador Meir, who was in charge of Israel's ties with the diaspora, especially American diaspora, and was very much involved with the brokering the compromise around the conversion bill controversy. Many people don't remember that, but in the mid-1990s, a major crisis erupted between American Jewry and Israel, the more progressive religious movements. And he's asking about what are the scenarios if a new administration is elected November 2020? What are the scenarios given the overall deterioration of the relationship between American Jewry and the State of Israel?
Well, the fact that Ambassador Meir can ask about the severe deterioration is a tragedy in its own right. How could we allow ourselves to reach this situation? We used to say, I think Ben-Gurion once said that, I mean, Israel has only one eternal ally, and that's the Jewish people. Well, we're risking that relationship, and we've risked it over a whole variety of things. The conversion issue is one, and the Wailing Wall, the Kotel issue, and the whole issue of the status of the non-Orthodox movements, and over strategic issues. Now, in some cases, it's okay not to agree, and you can have agreements, even strong ones within a family. I'm not sure that the American Jewish community always understands the security ramifications of various issues for Israel. In some cases, I even think they may be right for the wrong reasons. In some positions, it's very hard for people who live in a continental-sized country to understand the security considerations of a country which is not even 9 miles wide. That's a big lie that we all told ourselves. It's only 8.7 miles wide. So there are differences sometimes between the Jewish community in the US and in Israel. It's fine, it's legitimate. To allow ourselves to be in a position where there is a growing rift and a lot of people are simply furious. It started long before the kerfuffle over Iran with the Obama administration, with the Prime Minister's address to the Congress, but that was a turning point. And I would hope very much that we can go back to a more consensual approach. I also hear or read various American Jewish leaders, or not necessarily leaders, leaders in their own mind, businessmen, getting up and saying, oh, well, I don't like X, Y, Z about Israel. I'm disaffected, I'm alienated. I have a gentle and genteel recommendation for people who take that kind of position 70 plus years after Israel's independence, and only a slightly larger number of years since the Holocaust. I could suggest what they might want to do to themselves. Okay, we have only one Jewish state. It took us 2,000 years to restore our independence. There's a lot to be improved, to be fixed. We're in serious trouble in a whole variety of areas, serious trouble. There was once something called Jewish solidarity, which meant that we screamed and shouted at each other, but at the end of the day, we came together on what's important.